2. There we go. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Intelligent Disclosure. I'm Richard, and here's Tracy.
Hi, everyone.
Happy to be here with you again. We've got a pretty good track record of doing this live on time, by the way.
It's true.
I don't know how long we've been doing this, but it's been a while.
Mm-hmm.
And we always, with one or two exceptions, we've started on the dot.
Yeah.
And we've dove right in.
And I think we had a couple of times. Didn't we?
We had a few.
Yeah.
A couple. But basically, we're doing all right here.
I just want to say hi to the whole chat family. We see everybody gathering there.
Yes, indeed.
Yep. So happy you're here.
So last week, we did a presentation. I basically did a nice little discourse on Leonard Stringfield. I wanted to give you some insight into one of the most important and relatively forgotten UFO researchers who really got into the whole phenomenon of alien crash retrievals and bodies and everything else associated with that. So this week we wanted to continue that, and I actually would like to come back to Stringfield's research on another week. I think this is a theme we can work this theme for a while because there's so much there. But for this week, I wanted to take you through what I personally feel is the most fascinating trail of breadcrumbs that UFO research offers, at least in the realm of UFO crash retrievals and alien beings. And that's what I often call the Smith-Sarbacher-Walker Saga. And I'll explain all what that means just very shortly. I know it's not sexy.
We will tease it out.
Tease it out. It's not an exciting title. I don't know how better. I haven't come up with a better title.
I know it's easier when it's Roswell or Aztec, but this one needs teasing. But it gets so interesting the more you tease it. So
I told Tracy about this earlier today. I said, "Yeah, it's the Smith-Sarbacher-Walker Saga," and you're like,
"Yeah, no. I need to know. I want to know all the players, and I want to understand who they are, what they do, and it's important." To pull it all apart and really understand the chain that happened.
It didn't really have a lot of resonance with you initially, but once but I did explain it, you got into it. And it's a fascinating story, and I prepared some good visuals for you to help walk you through it. So I believe that will be a useful thing for you. Anything we want to talk about? One or two things before we jumped in.
Well, one thing. We had some travel recently, as some of you know, and I think we talked about it on the last show. We had some issues with travel. We won't go deep into that, but
except a 9-hour layover at O'Hare. Fun times.
A couple of malfunctioning planes, luckily on the ground.
Software issues for navigation.
Yeah, and somehow through all of that, we both ended up getting sick. I guess it's an airport thing. That doesn't usually happen to me. I'm usually bringing the emergency kit for him. But
I get sick a lot when I travel. It definitely happps. But this time you got nailed.
It took me down. So the only reason why we're saying this is not for sympathy or anything like that, but the tail end of it is just a brutal cough. And so I just might have to duck out. That's all. I'm not going to sit here and cough on camera and slow down the presentation. So if it
she
happens,
has her standards.
I'm just
Tracy's got her standards.
Duck out, and that's that.
And coughing is below your standards.
Well, no, I don't want to ruin the experience for other people. So
if you notice after we take a visual off the camera that Tracy's not there,
I snuck out, that's why.
Don't have a riot. Don't think like something bad has happened. It's just you're taking a quick moment.
Probably. I can already feel it starting.
I told
I'm doing
you.
My best.
I said,
cool.
like, if you're not on this, they'll be like, pitchforks and torches are going to be coming.
I'm sure. Yeah.
They want you here.
Anyhow. So there was that. And then Project Blue Book. So last week, everybody probably saw the Betty and Barney Hill case.
Yes.
So we haven't said anything for a long time. We knew people would have some issues with how that one went down.
Well, the fact that you have, the thing about the Betty and Barney Hill case, many things about it. In 1961, they were an interracial couple. And, Betty Hill was white. Barney Hill was African-American. And, of course, the series did not treat it that way. They treated them both as African-American.
Mm-hmm.
And
But we've since learned part of the rationale.
A little bit of the rationale. Well, actually, I'm just guessing.
No,
at the
actually, yeah,
rationale.
this is your speculation.
My guess for the rationale is that because they said it not in 1961, but in 1952, I guess. So they got the change the time, and I'm just guessing. They thought maybe it didn't seem as credible to have an interracial couple earlier in the 50s. I'm only guessing here. But I don't know why they made that decision. I mean, it's actually an important part of the case in the sense that as an interracial couple in 1961, they didn't want publicity. Like they weren't looking to be in the newspapers as we've been abducted by aliens. Like that was the last thing that they wanted. So the fact that they were, that Betty was white and Barney was black was a significant element in the story, and that was removed from the telling of it in the series, unfortunately, in my opinion.
Well, which was super shocking to us. We've been sitting on that one for a long time. We were like, why? Yeah. Why that of all things?
I know. But didn't have to be.
That's right. So, and tonight is the season finale. So we'll see what people think about that.
I've fallen behind on my Saturday live streams to talk about the real cases behind the Blue Book series. I will continue that, but Saturday was not possible.
That was that crazy travel day.
Out and about.
So
we'll catch up.
Yeah, we definitely will.
So
I think that's about it. We should probably just get right in there.
I think so. I want to talk about this ongoing there's such amount of deep research on the phenomenon of acquired alien tech and acquired non-human beings. All right. So again, this is a saga. I'm going to want you to walk through this trail of breadcrumbs with me as I explain to you just why this is one of the most interesting stories in all of UFO lore. And one of our friends and colleagues, Grant Cameron, was involved in the tail end of investigating this as well. He had a lot to say about it. Grant was looking into this in like 1989 and 90. Actually, even earlier than 1989, I think in 1987 or 88. So before I get into the actual detail, I'll just mention like the state of UFO research in, say, the 1980s was relating to crash retrieval. It was very tepid. And in other words, researchers at that time were thinking, crash retrievals, what are you, crazy? There was actually a printed debate in the International UFO Reporter, the IUR, between David Jacobs, this is 1985, and Richard Hall, Richard Hall is no longer alive, on the idea of crash retrievals. And in Jacobs' opinion, it was absolutely no crash retrievals. And Richard Hall gave a definite maybe to crash retrievals. Jacobs' opinion was that the idea of crash retrievals was just so outlandish that, to have a cover up on this was, he said it would have to be so immense that it would be impossible to keep this secret. Like you hear this among skeptics today. And this was not simply David Jacobs' position in 1985. It was a lot of other UFO researchers believe this. He said, look, if you're going to go that route, then you need absolute proof of alien hardware. Otherwise, nothing else is going to work. He said, look, we've got documents through Freedom of Information. There's nothing that indicates that the U.S. government is systematically even investigating UFOs, much less retrieving crash UFOs. I think even in 1985, that was a very, very conservative argument. He says all this information is anecdotal, it's mostly anonymous, and if you keep following up on these leaks, you're just going to be wasting your time. So that's it. Now, Richard Hall, I don't agree with everything Richard Hall has said and done in his career, but I agree with him on this point at this particular juncture. He said, look, there may seem to be a kind of ridiculousness to the idea of crash retrievals, but there is, he wrote, a small but growing body of credible reports that suggested this. And Richard Hall pointed out, he said, there's a man named Dr. Robert Sarbacher. And Robert Sarbacher certainly qualifies as a leading scientist who has made several statements about UFO crash retrieval programs. And, Richard Hall just said, look, to those of you who are skeptical about this, I recommend be a little more cautious before you condemn this idea that of crash retrievals of UFOs. Now, I think it was very interesting that Richard Hall mentioned Robert Sarbacher, because Sarbacher is a critically important person in this whole story that I want to tell you. But I want to back it up now and start with a man that I think I've shared this image before with you. This is Wilbert Smith, and one of your Canadian
that's how I know we've shared
frères from the past. Wilbert Smith. Wilbert Smith died the year I was born, 1962. And this is a picture of him probably circa 1950 or so. But he was a very important man in all of this, and really the starting point of our journey this evening. In 1950, Wilbert Smith was a Canadian government official. He was like a mid to upper level official with the Canadian Department of Transportation. He was also deeply interested in UFOs. He became a friend of Donald Kehoe through the 1950s, by the way, and was very much a friend of good UFO research, and himself was a very good UFO researcher. And he had a very scientific bent about it, scientific as well as brave. Wilbert Smith was into things like consciousness way before anyone else was. And he had an idea that these alien beings were friendly. He believed that we really had a lot to learn from them. So that was his approach. And he goes down in 1950 to the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C. So while he's there, he has a meeting. And it turns out that it's with Dr. Robert Sarbacher. But it's a quiet meeting. And Smith chats with him a little bit. And he comes back from that meeting. This is a picture of Washington, D.C., circa 1950 or so. Nice black and white photo. So he's down there and he meets with Sarbacher, now, who at the time was a young, brilliant U.S. defense scientist. He was very deeply involved with the whole defense community at the time. And Smith ends up writing a 3-page report to his government, to his supervisors in the Canadian Department of Transportation, about his meeting with U.S. officials. He does not mention Sarbacher by name, and this particular document remains classified for many years. Smith died in 1962. No one knew about this document when he died, and no one would know about it until the 1970s. So many, many years later. Now, what's the big deal about this document? Well, I will show you. It's this second page of the document where he talks about a few very key things. And in fact, there's a lot of interest in this document, but for our purposes for this presentation, I want to point out these 3 quotes that he has on this particular page. He talks about flying saucers being, quote, the most highly classified subject in the United States government. He says flying saucers exist. And he says, again, according to his source within the United States scientific community, quote, concentrated effort is being made by a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush. Now, for those of you who don't know that name, he is not related to the Bush family of presidential fame, George Herbert Walker or George W. But Vannevar Bush was, I'll talk about him a little bit more later, he was probably the most powerful scientist in the United States at that time. So Smith writes this memo, and a number of years go by. Let me stop this broadcast. That's Arthur Bray, and I'll mention him in a minute. That was a much younger me, by the way.
I just
the darker hair and like, oh, what's that? But many years go by, and nothing is known of this memo. So we go all through the 1950s, 1960s. No one knows about this. UFO researchers are going through this attempt to try to get any information out of the U.S. government that they can. People like James McDonald learned in the 1960s of like the Robertson panel, and he was shocked that the CIA was managing UFO matters in the U.S. So that's where we were at. We were not anywhere at memos like what Wilbert Smith wrote. to the Canadian government.
Mm-hmm.
So that comes out in the later 1970s, where it's kind of a bombshell. But even so, you might think, well, this is just one Canadian bureaucrat writing to his government about a conversation he has with some unnamed scientist. What's the big deal? You know, is this actionable information? And at that point, all you can say, it's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And there's really no proof of anything other than that he had a conversation with someone. Now, so the years go by and enter this gentleman, Arthur Bray. And I got to meet Arthur Bray back in 2005. I did in fact, I was in Toronto in 2005 for the lecture in which Paul Hellyer introduced himself to the world as someone interested in UFOs.
That's interesting, yeah.
Paul Hellyer, of course, was famous in Canada already, but Stanton Friedman was there. Steve Bassett, I think, was there. I was there, and maybe Paola Harris was there as well. In fact, I'm not sure. I think so. So we were there in Toronto, but while I was there, I was also in the Canadian National Archives in Ottawa, and I was able to meet Arthur Bray. And I can't remember where we actually were, but that's where in his living room. He's a very nice man. So Arthur Bray was a good UFO researcher, and he was in the Wilbert Smith papers. Wilbur Smith was long dead. Arthur Bray was going through these papers in Ottawa, and he finds, there's that cough. How you doing there?
I'm doing my best.
All right.
Keeping a lid on it.
Arthur Bray finds a link to that man, Dr. Robert Sarbacher. And that's a picture of Robert Sarbacher. In fact, that was taken in 1950 by the Saturday Evening Post. So Robert Sarbacher was a very well-known, brilliant scientist who had his own publicity about him. So he was a very known quantity at the time. So what Arthur Bray found was handwritten notes by Wilbert Smith that mentioned Robert Sarbacher. This is September 15th, 1950, and it's transcripts of an interview with Robert I. Sarbacher, and this is the page in question. Just want to show folks that this is where the information comes from, and this is what Smith wrote on that page. So WBS is Wilbert Smith, excuse me, and he says to Sarbacher, I have read Scully's book on the saucers. And Scully's book, of course, is Frank Scully's book, Behind the Flying Saucers, which is about the Aztec crash. And we wanted to talk about that. He says, I've read Scully's book on the saucers. Scully's book, excuse me. That was the only book published at the time on UFOs. This is September 1950. And would like to know how much of it is true. And Sarbacher says, according to Smith's handwritten notes, the facts reported in the book are substantially correct. Smith asks, the saucers do exist? And Sarbacher says, yes, they exist. And Tracy's taking on. You're going to go out. Come back if you feel better. I feel bad. So my dear wife has had to take a quick moment out. I think you heard the coughing. We're going to wish her luck, and hopefully she'll come back. So at this point, Smith gets what really does appear to be a confirmation from Sarbacher that this flying saucer phenomenon is real. In fact, there's much more that he talks about in his memo to the Canadian government that's really quite interesting, including the fact that this phenomenon seems to be connected with mental phenomenon. Grant Cameron has really unpacked a lot of that and talked about it at length, but I'm going to leave that alone for the moment. For right now, we're at the point where Arthur Bray in the early 1980s has discovered this handwritten note by Wilbert Smith relating to Robert Sarbacher and pinpointing Sarbacher. Now, the interesting thing about this is that Sarbacher was alive in the early 1980s. And what that means is that people could talk to Robert Sarbacher. That's very interesting. And indeed, they did. This is a book written by William Steinman called UFO Crash, UFO Crash at Aztec, excuse me, a well-kept secret. Steinman, I don't have any pictures of William Steinman. I would show you. Otherwise, I spoke to him myself about 10 plus years ago. He's retired fundamentally from UFO research. But in the 1980s, William Steinman was one of the most active and valuable UFO researchers out there by far. And this is a very large book he wrote about the Aztec crash. But in addition to researching the Aztec crash, Steinman was researching a variety of leads, and he hunted down Robert Sarbacher and spoke with Sarbacher and developed a bit of a rapport with him. And as a result of their conversation, Sarbacher wrote in 1983 a 2-page type letter. You can see it right here, single space type. There's a lot of information on that letter in response to Steinman's inquiries relating to his meeting with Wilbert Smith and much more. And here are the key things that Sarbacher wrote back. So Sarbacher did say, yes, I did meet with Wilbert Smith, and essentially says fundamentally that what Smith was talking about was true. Sarbacher gave a lot more information, and I'm showing you some of the key quotes here. He said that he had indeed been invited to participate in several discussions associated with the reported recoveries. He made it very clear that he himself was not personally involved in the recoveries, but that he knew about them. And then he goes on and drops a couple of important names here. John von Neumann was definitely involved, said Robert Sarbacher. Dr. Vannevar Bush was definitely involved. And then he says, and I think Dr. Robert Oppenheimer also. Those are 3 major names. You will recall that Vannevar Bush was mentioned by Smith years earlier in his 1950 memo to the Canadian supervisors. So here's Sarbacher, more than 3 decades later, also mentioning Vannevar Bush's name. He goes on, he said at another point, certain materials reported to have come from flying saucer crashes were extremely light and very tough. I am sure our laboratories analyzed them very carefully. And he also stated, I remember in talking with some of the people at the office that I got the impression these aliens were constructed like certain insects. That's amazing. That's an amazing statement. And again, so this is the second time Vannevar Bush is mentioned, and he mentioned Dr. John von Neumann. That's an incredible thing. Von Neumann was probably the most brilliant mathematician of the 20th century. I mean, there are people who consider von Neumann to be the most brilliant mind like ever in human history. I know that he has his defenders on that. In fact, I have a little slide on von Neumann I want to share with you here. He was an absolutely extraordinary individual. And my wife is coming back. Good. You're off camera now, so
we'll see how long
this lasts. But von Neumann was an absolute genius in every respect. But what is interesting here that I want to point out is von Neumann was actually in a very excellent position in terms of his career to have done exactly what Sarbacher said. After the Second World War, of course, he was deeply involved in the Manhattan Project. He did some of the key mathematics to make that project a success. He then, after the war, was on the General Advisory Committee of the Atomic Energy Commission, the AEC. And if you know your UFO history, you will know that the AEC was deeply involved in the UFO phenomenon in the sense that UFOs were seen repeatedly over critically important AEC installations. Los Alamos, Hanford in the state of Washington, Oak Ridge, all of these were subject to constant violations by UFOs, and von Neumann was part of that. So you have the world's greatest living genius in this man, and he is part of it, and he knows about it. And he also was a consultant for a number of military organizations, including the U.S. Air Force in general. That's interesting. And then part of the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project, that's the AFSWP. That's really important to me because the AFSWP was similarly deeply concerned with things like the green fireball sightings that were centered over Los Alamos in New Mexico in the late 1940s, early 50s. So von Neumann would have been very much involved in those discussions, as well as at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. All of these utterly key scientific institutions that are clearly concerned with the UFO phenomenon. Lawrence Livermore, not as overtly so, but there's no question that it would be. And then you have Dr. Vannevar Bush. By the way, it occurred to me that he looks a little bit like the Wicked Witch of the West in that picture. I'm not trying to be mean.
No.
But he's got the whole head, the face thing going, like he's her brother.
Oh, stop.
A little bit. I'm just saying.
Just the shape of the face.
The shape, yeah. But he was
You have a brilliant imagination.
But this is Van Bush here. And Vannevar Bush was not simply a brilliant scientist and engineer in his own right, absolutely top of the line in every way, but he was a master organizer and a master manager of people and organizations. And this is why he was not only the chief scientific advisor to President Roosevelt and President Harry Truman, the top science guy, okay? But he managed the Manhattan Project. He managed all wartime military research and development. It was all under him. And he was really more than any other person responsible for the creation of the National Science Foundation after the war. And of course, if you know your MJ-12 lore, he is mentioned as one of the key members of MJ-12. And in the famous memo that was attributed by Harry Truman establishing MJ-12, Vannevar Bush's name appears very prominently in that. So that's Van Bush. And this is Dr. Eric A. Walker, and I want you to get a good look at that face. This is Eric Walker in 1950. And this is the man that at the end of Sarbacher's life, we're talking early 1980s now, you know, Sarbacher had written this 2-page letter to William Steinman talking about how this is, yes, this all seemed to be real, and he had not been part of the crash retrieval meetings, but he knew someone who was, and he couldn't remember it at first. Steinman, based on all of these different clues that he was getting, realized that it was probably Walker. He talks with Sarbacher, and Sarbacher says, absolutely for sure, it was indeed Eric Walker. He's the guy. So who is Eric Walker, you ask? Eric Walker was probably most famous as the president of Penn State University. So that's a very publicly prominent job. But more important than that, for 5 years, he was the chair of a think tank that many people, I think, have never heard of, but it was called the Institute for Defense Analysis, actually analyses. I think it's plural. I should have an E there. The IDA. And this is one of the most elite military think tanks in the United States. And he was chair of it for 5 years, but I think he was actually the effective head of it for much more than that. And then for 2 years, and I think this is where the UFO connection really comes in strongly, from 1950 to 1951, he was the executive secretary of the military's Research and Development Board. And it was as a member in that capacity that he, according to Sarbacher, attended meetings at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base concerning UFO crash retrievals. So that's Walker. Now, many years go by, you know, between the 1950s and the 1980s. And here's Steinman now being told, yes, Eric Walker. Then Sarbacher dies. And there's Steinman, there's Stanton Friedman, who had also talked with Sarbacher, had not gotten the lead on Walker, but Steinman did. Grant Cameron, Scott Crane, 2 young researchers in the 1980s, they learn about this through their connections with Steinman, and they're talking about it. Steinman, here's Walker in later years, and Steinman finds him in a phone call in 1987, shortly after the MJ-12 record story had come out. They had previously corresponded with Walker and just basically got blown off. And in 1987, Steinman reaches Walker and talks about MJ-12 with him. And this is August 30th, 1987. And the two of them speak on the phone. So Steinman, let me stop the screen share here for a second. Steinman calls Walker and he says, I'm calling in reference to meetings that you attended at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base around 1949 or 1950. Now, I will guarantee you when Steinman says that to Walker, Walker is totally going to be caught off guard.
Mm-hmm.
Like no one on the outside would have known that this was the case. I don't think Walker had any clue that anyone had been talking with Sarbacher. And I'm sure Eric Walker was quite confident that he was going to go for the rest of his life without anyone knowing about this. And here comes this guy out of the blue saying, oh, yeah, I know that you were at Wright-Pat around 1950 having meetings concerning crash disks. So, and the MJ-12 documents had just been publicized and there was all of this argument about them. So you can easily see how Eric Walker would be caught a little bit off his guard at this moment. So amazingly, Walker replies, yes, he says, I attended meetings concerning that subject matter. According to Steinman, those are the exact words. And then he says, why are you getting so worked up over this? What's the big deal? You can imagine Steinman's like, well, what are you talking about?
Mm-hmm.
He says, we're talking about the actual recovery of a flying saucer not built or constructed on this earth, he says. And he says, furthermore, we're talking about bodies of the occupants that were analyzed to be human-like but not human. So, of course, I'm going to get worked up. Steinman, I just love this whole story because he's so involved. He's so emotionally engaged, like I think many ordinary, like normal people would.
Mm-hmm.
But if you saw that picture of Walker, you can see Walker. This is why you get guys like that running programs like that. You can see Eric Walker was someone who had very, very strong control over himself in all aspects of his life. I have no doubt about this. Was absolutely brilliant. And probably, I'm going to guess, didn't have the same ordinary kinds of emotional reactions that regular people like us would have at something so momentous.
Mm-hmm.
I think Walker was very much used to keeping control. But here, Walker was caught off his guard.
Mm-hmm.
And he admits it, but he's like, what's the big deal? Like, you're getting worked up over nothing. He says, what's there to get all excited about? What's the concern? And Steinman was expecting a challenging interview, but this was a nonchalance that he wasn't really expecting. And so he's asking more questions. And he says, have you heard of the MJ-12 group or Project Majestic 12? And Walker shocked him. He says, yes, I know of MJ-12. I've known of them for 40 years. There's a wow moment.
Yeah.
He says, I believe you're chasing after windmills. You're delving into an area you can do absolutely nothing about. So why get involved with it? Why be all concerned about it? Why don't you just leave it alone and drop it? Forget about it.
Wow.
That's Eric Walker on the phone with Steinman. So Steinman's like, I'm not going to drop it. The public has a right to know. We have a right to know the truth. And he keeps on with Walker, and Walker continues to chat with him on this phone call. This is August 1987.
Gosh, too bad they didn't have the apps we have now where it would just record.
The whole thing would have been recorded, right?
Yeah.
But it was 32.
Not that that's a good thing. But in this case,
you'd want it for this, for sure.
Yeah.
But I will just say this. I think you might have still been out of the room. And I talked about that I personally did speak with William Steinman over a decade ago. I had a very long conversation with him about research. And I will say, I found William Steinman, he's retired from UFO research, but I found him to be absolutely forthright, honest in every way that I can imagine. He didn't really want to do UFO research anymore, but he was very very straightforward with me, and I don't think there's any reason to doubt how he describes his conversation with Walker. And as people will see, other people also had encounters with Walker that are similar to what happened here with Steinman. In any case, Steinman says, look, do you remember any details regarding recovery operations of UFOs and any analysis? And again, this is a surprising answer. Walker's like, I'm sure I've got notes around the house somewhere concerning my meetings at Wright-Patterson. He said I'd have to dig them out and read them over in order to jog my memory. So I could kind of believe that. 30 years go by. He's, lived his life since then. I don't know how involved in the UFO subject Eric Walker really was in the late 1980s. But he's also saying, like, I've got notes.
Yeah.
And I need to jog my memory. And he says, that's the best I can do for right now. So that was the end of it. And
can I just ask?
Yeah.
I think people are probably wondering, why do we think he would be so willing to have this discussion so openly like this? What do we think about that?
Well, no one knows.
Right.
So that's one thing. So all we can do is speculate. I'm going to give my speculation, which, as I was sort of implying, I think Eric Walker was caught off guard.
It's just
I think it's simple as that. Like, you've had this secret information for decades, and suddenly a researcher out of the blue gives you, chapter and verse of the things that you were involved in. Meetings at Wright-Patterson in 1950 on crash retrievals. You
don't want to look bad kind of thing.
No, like, exactly. I think that, and also it's the 1980s. It's not 2019 where everything is recorded 24/7 all the time. I think there was a different culture, and people, I think if he was caught off guard, he might have been much more likely to speak what he thought might have been off the record. How are you going to prove it? He might be thinking, right? Even in the 80s, it was possible to record telephone calls, but it wasn't a normal thing that people did. So my hunch is that Walker was caught off guard and then just made light of it. Like, what's the big deal? And I think that's probably it. Like, what are you going to do about it? Essentially, we've got the media on our side. We've got everyone on our side. You're just some guy tilting at windmills.
Right.
So that's the best answer I could give on this matter. Steinman kept up a correspondence with Walker. That was the only time that they spoke. And Walker said things like, some things you have right, some things you have very wrong. He said, we did recover a machine. Obviously, he said it was a landing vehicle only. And he said, I believe it's still being stored near Wright Field, he wrote. And then he said something that was very odd, actually.
That wasn't odd.
Well, what I'm about to say is even more odd. So was Walker messing with Steinman? Steinman wondered. Grant Cameron later wondered, and I wonder. He said, we didn't get any dead bodies found at this particular site. We only found 4 normal human-looking males who were very alive, but he did imply that they were kind of alien. He said, this is a direct quote from what Walker wrote to Steinman. He said, unfortunately, they had no memory of anything in the past, probably by design, he writes, but they were highly intelligent. He said they learned the English language within a few hours. And it was our decision not to make public spectacles of them, but to allow them to be absorbed into American culture as soon as we were sure they did not bring any contamination with them. And I mean, that just seems like an outrageous statement and not a believable statement.
Right.
To me.
Learning English in a few hours.
And it's not that they couldn't do it, but like, you're just going to let them go into society. So I really wonder, like, was Walker trying to do his own little damage control?
Right.
Like, after he lets something out and now he's just dropping something ridiculous for Steinman to follow up on. Steinman himself.
I'm sorry, you said this was in the same phone call?
No, this is in a letter following up.
Oh, okay.
Letter following up that Steinman received from Walker.
Interesting.
So then he just goes on and says, each of these 4 went on to have very successful careers in what they did: technology, sports, and finance. So who's the famous athlete that's from Alien an alien athlete. We don't know, but that's what he kind of implied. And he said there was a fourth person. I can't remember what happened. Like, so that's it. Steinman was very, very puzzled over this letter. And they're like, is this, and it seemed to contradict, by the way, what Sarbacher had said, which is that he speculated that these beings were insect-like in nature. And here's Walker saying something very, very different. Like, no, they're totally human. So it's very bizarre. It seemed not very plausible to Steinman. It doesn't seem plausible to me that the U.S. military is just going to let these human aliens just traipse on off into American society. Like Cameron and Stott Crane and Eric Walker Steinman wondered, is this a joke by Walker? And
was this an unsolicited letter? I'm sorry, did you see
no,
that?
it was Walker writing back to Steinman.
Just
like in reply. So it's
in
very
reply
rare.
to the phone call?
In reply to the phone call and to a letter Steinman had written.
Okay, so Steinman did write a letter.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So that's the state of affairs in the late 80s. And what you find with Walker is that he really starts to back away from these researchers. Scott Crane, who was living in Pennsylvania, tried to reach Walker, who was in the same state. And Walker is just like, nope, not interested, not going to talk. I want nothing to do with any of this stuff. So that's where matters stood at the late 1980s. And I want to share a screen here and take the story a little bit further. So there's Walker talking about this. And this is him talking to Steinman, just forget about it, drop it, and so forth. Now enter a fellow named Armen Victorian, also known as Dr. Henry Azadehdel. It's a hard name for me to pronounce. He's Armenian, as it turns out. In fact, this is such an interesting man. He actually had several aliases. There was a documentary made about him. He was clearly a very, very capable, smart man who had his fingers in a lot of pies. He had been arrested in 1989 of stealing and smuggling endangered orchids. So there's that whole thing. And he talked like how he'd made this huge amount of money doing all of that. He was also very interested in UFOs, though, and was actively researching an alleged South African UFO crash from the late 1980s. So he was in correspondence with Grant Cameron. And it was through Grant that he learned about this whole dealing with Eric Walker. So as Dr. Henry Azadehdel, and I don't think he's actually a doctor, but he can talk a good game. He finds Eric Walker and he gets Eric Walker to talk a little bit more. Now we're in 1989, 1990. He writes to Walker in December of 89, and they have a phone call in January of 1990. And this is just amazing stuff. He goes on and on. He says, "Doctor, have we ever captured anything at all? We must have." Walker says, "Sure." He says, "Did we learn anything?" Walker, "Yeah, I think so." "Is it determined from which star system they come from?" "I do not think so." "Have we ever been able to make contact with them on the communication basis?" And Walker says, "We promise not to tell." So is Walker just playing games with him or not? Armen Victorian goes on. He says, "Have we ever been able to make contact with them?" Oh, I said that. "Do they constitute any threat to the national security of any country?" And Walker says, "Everyone decides that on his own." So these are actually plausible answers. But you don't know, is it blowing him off, or is it he's just maybe a little bit of both? And then Armen Victorian says, "Do you know whether there is any cooperation between them, these EBEs, and us as an advanced civilization?" And he says, "I think so. There have been occasions, but then I can only speak for myself." So he's just blowing him off, but he's also not denying any of this. Right. So then it goes on. This is a lot here, and I don't want to I probably have too much text here, but he goes on. This is a second phone call from March of 1980. "Are the MJ-12 documents authentic?" And at this point, Walker says, "I don't think so." So this is 3 years after Walker's conversation with William Steinman, where he's totally caught off guard. Some time has passed, and now Walker is familiar with the MJ-12 docs, and he's saying, I don't think they're authentic. But then the follow-up question, but is there any such group? And there's silence. And then this is the most interesting element of all of Walker's conversations with Armen Victorian. He says, how good is your mathematics? It's like he changes the subjects.
Who says that to who?
Dr. Walker says this to Armen Victorian, who's calling him. And Victorian says, well, as good as it can be for a doctor in physics, but why? And Walker says, because only a very few people are capable in handling this issue. It brings to mind someone like John von Neumann, who was a genius mathematician who was involved. He says, only a very few people capable of handling this issue. Unless your mind ability is like Einstein's or likewise, I don't think how you can achieve anything in this. In other words, they're not going to want you in the program unless you're a mathematical genius, essentially. But Armen Victorian's not done. He says, well, for many years I've been trying, but are there government scientists? And he says, everyone mistakes about this issue. I gather by that you mean whether they work for the defense establishment of the military. And he says, that's where you're wrong. They are a handful of elite. When you are invited into that group, I would know. And then Armen Victorian asks, is this group like the Bilderbergs, Pugwash, which no one really talks about them, but another elite group, or the Trilaterals? More silence. Walker says, something like that. Are you a member of that group? And Walker says, I cannot answer that. And then the other fascinating question. First, how good is your math? Second, how good is your seventh sense? How much do you know about ESP?
Okay, interesting.
Indeed. And the Victorian says, well, I know to some degree about ESP and EVP, electronic voice phenomena, I assume. But what has that got to do with any of this? And Walker says, unless you know about it and know how to use it, you would not be taken in. Only a few know about it. So that's amazing stuff.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. That is interesting. So even if he's blowing him off or whatever the reasons are that he's acting so nonchalant and just giving these sort of seemingly rote answers,
right?
He peppers in these fascinating
and they're things that make sense, don't they?
Well, yeah, with everything
Math
that we know.
And psi phenomenon.
That's right.
Like you've got to have your game on at the highest level to be involved in this type of program. And, you know, this is back in 1990. There's no internet. There's no large conversations about any of this. It's a very kind of relatively quiet world that existed. Walker's having this conversation. He could just as easily have hung up the phone.
Yeah.
And yet they're having this long conversation. It went on a little bit, by the way. Armen Victorian, as Dr. Henry Azadehdel says, have we mastered the knowledge? Are we working together with these beings? And Walker says that we actually had learned a lot, but we are not working with them, only contact, he said. So that's interesting. And then the question was, have we captured any saucers, any material from the discs to study? And then, you know, he says kind of what he said a few years earlier to William Steinman, which is, look, this technology is far beyond what we know in ordinary terms of physics. He says, you're pushing for answers, aren't you? As I said, it is far beyond the known level of physics that's known. Very few have knowledge with it. And he starts to just say, they had one more phone call in August of 1990. And at this point, Walker really was backing away. And let me just share this slide here so you can see what I'm talking about. He says, look, this is none of your concern, all right? You don't have the skills to be brought in. You're just doing this to satisfy your own personal curiosity. And I'm not playing that game with you. All right. He says it's not going to do any damn good except to make you happy. Are we going to change all the plans and regulations just to make you happy? If you say that you're looking for the truth, you'll never get it anyway, so forget it.
Wow.
That's Walker, 1990. And that was really the last statement Eric Walker made to anyone, as far as I know, about the UFO phenomenon. And And then he died 5 years after that. But he essentially became reclusive to any attempts by researchers to contact him. So I think it's a fascinating little trail.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, it starts with Wilbur Smith in 1950 having a little conversation with Robert Sarbacher,
mm-hmm.
who himself was one of the highest, most well-plugged-in defense scientists of his era. Sarbacher leads them to Eric Walker, and in the process does a great deal of confirmation as well of crash retrieval program. And I mean, in this particular presentation, I didn't really have a lot to say about actual aliens, physiology or biology. We'll come back to that maybe in another one. But I really feel like this is a very important series of pieces of evidence to put together
mm-hmm.
that form, as I like to say, a trail of breadcrumbs
mm-hmm.
leading to quite a strong level of confirmation about this phenomenon.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
You know, so that's basically it.
Mm.
That's essentially what I've got here for this.
I mean, I have to say, I'm sure some people have the same reaction as me, that it's amazing that that they're talking to people, that they were talking to researchers, that Sarbacher was ever talking to researchers, and that Walker was talking to researchers.
I know it's surprising, but maybe we shouldn't be that shocked because it did happen. You know, in the case of Sarbacher's letter.
And they seem guarded anyways. I mean, Walker seemed really guarded in what he was saying. He was either being super careful or, you know, just feeling, he almost sounds like, so, you know, he's prepared that someone's listening. Like he's being very vague, but then he drops these little things.
But the thing that I would remind all of us is that all of these people are human beings. So they have their own emotions. They have their own unpredictability. We're not robots, and we're not the aliens. We are human beings. And as such,
we react.
We do react. And that includes even people with prominent, powerful classified clearances, it seems to me. Even people as brilliant as Eric Walker and Robert Sarbacher, toward the end of their life, if in the right circumstances, caught off guard, they can talk. Why Sarbacher wrote that 2-page letter is a great question to ask, and I don't know the answer, but he did. He did do it. And it was a matter of discussion. In a lot of circles, it was not publicized, but people knew about it. Ben Rich of Lockheed Skunk Works, he knew about it. And his colleagues knew about it. It was all being discussed in the 1980s. We can come back to that some other time, perhaps. But people were very aware. Like what Sarbacher had to say was very important.
Right. Didn't you say that one of the things that sort of was a factor that you felt was playing in was that, I can't remember which one of them it was that you were referring to, but they sort of were under the assumption that the momentum was going to bring this out anyhow, that this information was going to become public. Last
week when we did a previous episode on aliens and evidence and reports, we talked a lot about Leonard Stringfield. And indeed, Stringfield, talking in the late 70s, he had just written a book called Situation Red, which had a small chapter on UFO crash retrievals. And that was kind of a big deal at the time. We're talking 1976, 77 era. Jimmy Carter is elected president in November of 76. And there had been a lot of UFO chat around Jimmy Carter because he had seen a UFO in 1969, and he was open about it. So there was this belief, it was a mistaken belief, but still people thought Jimmy Carter might release UFO information. And so there is that whole thing lurking around. And then plus the fact that Stringfield had simply put himself into this publicly by talking about it, brought a number of people to him. And indeed, some of them, at least a few of them, stated, I'm talking to you because, well, the president's going to come out with it anyway, so why not?
Right.
So yeah, and that's kind of relevant to Walker in a way.
Right.
I think that's what you were kind of getting at.
Yeah. Now I want to bring up the Aztec UFO crash. If you could just maybe start with Scully's book, but I mean, that is an example where there were bodies reported. There were several witnesses on scene. And we said we were just going to touch upon that.
Yes, absolutely. It's a fascinating story. In fact, I've got Scully's book downstairs. I didn't bring it up. I do have two of the other books on the. This is Steinman's book on the UFO crash at Aztec.
You gotta go a little closer there.
I think you can see that there. It's a little shiny, right? And this is an earlier version of Scott and Suzanne Ramsey's book, actually done also with Dr. Frank Thayer on the Aztec incident. My version is not the latest. This is the problem of when people do revised versions of the book. I need to get there 2015. I have the 2011, but it's still a great book. But it does start with Frank Scully's book, Behind the Flying Saucers. And so let's go back a little bit in time to this, because what happened was, this is an alleged, I think, a real UFO crash that took place in March 1948. And Aztec, New Mexico is located, it's at the Four Corners area. That's where New Mexico and Colorado and Utah and Arizona meet. So it's Four Corners. And this is a very remote area. In fact, it's almost surrounded by Native American reservations to this day. So what a lot of people often forget is that for many years, the main UFO crash case wasn't Roswell. It was Aztec. The Roswell thing came out for one day and then was buried. The Aztec crash was written about by Frank Scully, who was a journalist, comes out with a book in 1950 called Behind the Flying Saucers. And he had two main sources for this story. He had a friend named Silas Newton, and then he had an acquaintance and an occasional business partner of Newton, who Scully in the book just called Dr. G. That's G-E-E in the book. And so according to Scully's story, there was a flying saucer that came down basically intact. Then the U.S. military gets it. And he actually had a fair amount of description here that he was told. There was a portal that was punctured, and they got into it through that way. And there was anywhere from 2 alien bodies to up to 16 alien bodies. Who knew how many there really were, but all these stories of alien bodies. They were small. They looked human, but they were very small.
They were about 3.5 feet.
And they were dead. And they were all
dead,
burnt.
And they were wearing clothing.
Right. So what was the clothing that you recall?
I think it was jumpsuits. They were wearing some sort of old jumpsuit. At least that was the
close-fitting type of a thing. Yeah, exactly. And so according to what Scully wrote, the whole flying saucer was taken apart and sent off to Wright Field, Patterson Air Force Base, Wright Field at the time in Dayton, Ohio. And that's where it sure would go, without a doubt.
Right.
So Scully writes his book in 1950. This was the book that Wilbert Smith was asking about in his meeting with Sarbacher. Is Scully's book legit? Sarbacher says it is substantially correct. So that's interesting. Nevertheless, a couple of years later, 1953, I think, a journalist named J.P. Kahn writes a series of exposés, devastating pieces, saying these witnesses of Scully's are total BS. Yeah. So you were following this as well. Were you? Because we were both looking into this earlier today.
Yeah, I doubt I was able to find as much as you in that short of time, but I was listening to more. I wanted to hear the things that were being said against and what ended up happening to that person who was going against the story. I just wanted to know. You mean
J.P. Kahn?
Yeah. Because a lot of people, I guess a lot of the skeptic websites sort of stop at his reports.
Right. And what he said is, he says, aha, there's no Dr. G. It's a guy named Leo Gebauer.
Right.
And he's a con man. And both of them are con men in the oil industry. This is the whole thing. And he said these two guys just hoaxed Scully. Scully was naive. He wasn't in on it. He just wasn't very sharp.
Right.
And they fooled him. He said Silas Newton lied about his education and had defrauded business associates in one form or another. In fact, both were convicted. This is what really made it look bad, of discrediting some Colorado businessman in some way. And that's where everyone leaves it, right?
Right. But I think that even the statement you just made, I think there's something wrong with that statement and about him being convicted. I was listening to Scott and Suzanne, and basically what I ended up learning.
Scott and Suzanne Ramsey.
Who are really the experts in this case.
They are indeed.
And I think that they would easily say, and respectfully, that if that's where people believe the research ends, they have not continued far enough along the journey, because it goes so much further digging into this controversy and this, I keep forgetting his name, who you just said.
J.P. Kahn.
J.P. Kahn, yeah.
Well, absolutely. And
debunking a lot of what he said.
Their work is so important. So what happened was, years go by and everyone says, oh, so the whole thing was a hoax. Steinman comes out in the 1980s and writes his book on Aztec, but it doesn't really do the job that people wanted. As big as a book it was, it really didn't. But Scott and Suzanne Ramsey really did do it. They succeeded where Steinman didn't quite make it. They did a whole analysis of J.P. Kahn, for one. And they found out Kahn originally he was so taken with the Aztec story, he wanted to co-author it with Scully. And Scully said, no, thanks, I don't really need you. Kahn took it as a personal affront and made it his business to try to destroy Frank Scully. So that definitely they bring out very, very clearly. The other thing is that Scully pointed out that this Dr. G was modeled on Gebauer, but not only on Gebauer. He says, look, I had multiple inside sources. I didn't just have this one guy. And he said Gebauer, didn't study at the University of Berlin like he said like Dr. G did, and didn't manage all these thousands of people doing experimental work. He was an engineer, and he did was in charge of like maintenance equipment, not research, at this air research company in Phoenix. So he had technical specs. But the interesting thing that Scott and Suzanne Ramsey learned is that Leo Gebauer had an FBI file on him of almost 400 pages. And to this day, half of those pages have not been declassified. Why?
Yeah, what's up with that?
So exactly, in the interest of national defense. So you have to wonder.
Okay.
But so here's the thing. So other people have looked into the Aztec case. Linda Moulton Howe looked into it. She actually interviewed members of a family called the Pace family near Farmington, which is right where all of this kind of happened. And they remembered hearing news of a UFO crash in the area. 1948, 1949, they weren't sure, but it was March. And then comes Scott Ramsey, and then he's joined by Suzanne. But Scott got into it on his own first, and no one has done more than those two. They contacted relatives of two former New Mexico police officers from the area who told their families that they saw a crash disc. And by the way, the place where it came down is Hart Canyon. That's the name of it. And they said it's 1948 March. And then they found a witness who claimed to have worked at Roswell and said that there was a concrete slab at the crash site that was used to support the crane that removed the craft at Aztec. So he says, there is this huge concrete slab that was put down there because this disc required a significant crane, and the crane required this slab. So they looked and looked and looked for the slab, and finally found the slab with the rebar. And the rebar in the concrete was dated to the 1940s. They think they've got it. And then, the whole thing about the vendetta by J.P. Kahn and all of that. I think what they did is and there's actually quite a lot more we should probably get.
Yeah. I was going to say, why don't we save the details of the case? Because the case really deserves its own show. The story
Yes,
is so
absolutely.
good. And I will say a lot of people ask about it in chat. You know, obviously I haven't been as deep in chat lately as I have in the past, but it does often come up because it is such an interesting case,
Right.
such an interesting crash retrieval case. And it has all of the elements that we want to discuss. And even the thorough debunking is important for everyone to hear, because there is such a wall for people around that case. You know, some people just think, no, it was all debunked, but no, it's worthy of a deep and thorough look over.
I think the debunking was definitely the dominant motif for many, many years. And you find a lot of researchers, even some of the more conservative ones, in my view, are looking, they're reviewing the Aztec case because of the work of Scott and Suzanne Ramsey. So I think it's mission accomplished for those two. I think they actually have succeeded, generally speaking, at least among UFO researchers. Now, in terms of the general public, totally different.
Yeah.
People don't know. I did interview Scott and Suzanne for a Richard Dolan show some years ago on KGRA, and I think I would like to bring them back, and we could do one for this channel and get that out there.
I think the public doesn't know, but you know, something that's really good for us to do is to really learn what the skeptics are saying and understand the rebuttal. So
have to.
So that if it does come down to it, and we are talking to people in the public who think it's all bunk, we know what we're talking about.
Well, I agree. And the other thing about with skeptics is, look, everyone should be skeptical.
Agreed.
You and I should be, and everyone ought to be, in the true scientific sense, which is, let's look for the evidence and let's not jump to conclusions. So you always want to know what skeptics are saying, even those skeptics who are knee-jerk skeptics.
Right.
You want to know what their argument is so that you can understand it. Sometimes they're right. Like they're often right. So the last thing you want to do is latch on to a case that's a losing cause.
Right.
Don't waste your time with that stuff. You want to focus on the things that are genuine. And so you need the skeptics for that reason, because they're willing to, more than the UFO believers, the problem with it, and because I am a believer and I can fall into the trap just like any other believer, which is when an interesting case comes your way, because you know that this phenomenon's real, you're inclined to say, okay, this could be real.
Right.
Whereas the skeptic's going to start from the assumption, no, it's not real, and here's why it isn't. And so both sides actually, you know, when you go into a new case, each has a point here.
Right.
At least from my point of view.
No.
So, but you want to know always what the skeptics have to say. And it's annoying to some believers because the skeptics, not always, but they can be kind of snarky, right? Because they're tired of the UFO believers, and the UFO believers are tired of the skeptics, so they can each be snarky with each other. And so one side doesn't like to listen to the other side, but we have to.
I agree. But it sounds to me like Scott and Suzanne have been working on this for so long that they have taken the time to go through all of the debunking, because they want it to pass the test as well. Yeah. So I think, you know, they went to great lengths. For example, I think one of the biggest things being said was, how would you get the craft out of that area? So I think Scott went through the trouble, or they both went through the trouble of building something that wide and moving it out of that area to see if it actually was possible. Oh,
wow. That's interesting.
So because they thought they'd invested so much in this case, you know, they have to listen to those skeptics, like you're saying, and they need to know as well, does it pass the test?
I assume they were successful.
They were successful. So again, another reason why this case in particular is a really good one for us to examine and listen to.
I like tying it in with tonight's chat because it really does come in together with Wilbert Smith asking about Scully's book, and Sarbacher back in 1950 saying the facts are substantially correct. I like that. And that whole case goes through years and years of dismissal and debunking, and finally it gets a really genuine revival through Scott and Suzanne. By the way, I met both of them in 2003, and I met them when they met each other. It was at a UFO event. Scott was already even then getting kind of really into the Aztec case. And yeah, it was at a UFO conference, and they met, they fell in love. They moved to the Atlantic coast, and they've been there ever since. And she has been every bit as involved in researching this as he has. So they're a great team, and two super, super wonderful people. I just can't say enough about them. You haven't met them yet, have you?
I have.
You have?
I have. I met them at Contact.
Oh, right.
Remember?
That's right. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I'm so
wonderful.
glad. Yeah. That's right.
We're going to have you on if you ever see this.
If you guys see this, please.
Hopefully, we'd like to. Anyway.
Yeah, I would like to bring you back on.
I think it's almost time here. So it's,
I think it is.
Yeah, 10 after.
So I don't know if we want to answer any questions from the people.
We'll see if
give you a little light there about that.
Anything here?
I feel pretty good about how we presented this theme. Again, I want to return and get some more into Leonard Stringfield stuff. I've got his book still lying around here. He has a wealth of information relating to the retrieval of UFOs and the study of the ETs themselves. So there's so much more to go into. I feel like in our time period where there's just so many claims that are out there, there are other claims that I personally feel are legit, and we really need to know what they are. And unpacking them is one of the things that I enjoy doing for this program. So anything in there that you see?
Okay, so I'm just looking at what we have, a few things that we have. Does Mr. Dolan have a personal library from 3D the Destroyer? Well, does he ever? Well,
yes. I mean, of course. I've 20 plus years ago, I had no UFO library, obviously. I just had a couple of thousand history books and philosophy and whatever, because that's all I do is I read and read and read and read. When I started with the UFO topic in 94, really was the first big year. I began collecting them then, and I don't know how many. I've got a couple of thousand UFO books. I was lucky in that there is a local gentleman from Rochester, New York, named William Sherwood, and I love this man to this day. He's long since deceased. Bill Sherwood and I were about 50 years apart, and so when I was just beginning the whole UFO trek, this is in the 1990s, looking for like a local Rochester group that I could talk to. And I remember looking on AOL, because this is like 1997, and I found the Rochester UFO Study Group. I thought, wow, perfect. Let's find them. Well, I'd learned that it was kind of defunct, but it was still listed in some kind of listing. And I wrote to them because they didn't even have email. And I left my phone number, and this very old man called me a couple of weeks later. He was 85 at the time. And it was Bill Sherwood, and we struck up a friendship. I visited him a number of times, and when he died, I think in 2008, he left me his entire library. Bill Sherwood had a legendary library. Like everyone knew about. He had been involved in UFOs since the 1950s. He was a Kodak engineer. He had patents to his name. He spoke fluent German, fluent Portuguese, learned Japanese in his 70s. How do you do that? Amazing. That was Bill Sherwood. And he and his wife were just absolutely lovely people. And he left me his massive library in his will. So what I had was more than doubled. His library was much larger than mine. So I have that, which gave me a complete collection of MUFON journals and the IURs and the APRO bulletins and the NICAP investigators and all these other countless journals that I never even knew about.
Right.
And he had them all. And not
fabulous. Only that, you also got files and files and files files of his own personal investigations, because it wasn't just like a meetup group. This was a study group.
Correct.
And from what I've gathered and seen myself, he took all subjects, not just UFO, but all the surrounding subjects as well, very, very seriously. And he took detailed notes.
He
on
did
them.
indeed.
So,
yeah, he was. I miss Bill. I saw him shortly before he died, and yeah, I have a lot of very fond memories of him. But to answer the question, yes, I have a good. There are people with a better UFO library than I have, for sure. But I would say mine is pretty good.
I would say it's pretty big.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So there's a long answer.
Big. You would find it big.
A long answer to the question.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see.
I see there's a remote viewing question in there.
Hey, Richard and Tracy, has anyone done a remote view on Pine Gap,
Australia?
I don't really know if anyone's done one.
They should.
And
you have thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, it depends who's doing it. It's one thing. It's really something interesting when there's a lot out on the internet these days saying something remote viewed, Pine Gap remote viewed. And I just want to say, just because it's remote viewed doesn't mean that that's reliable information. Classically, when they were doing it in Project Stargate, they're using teams of remote viewers. And not only that, most of these people have gone through a system where they have gone through training that works them up to an accuracy level. And then only after that is there a point of, sort of reliable information. Because when you're talking about somewhere like Pine Gap, you're talking about something that cannot be, you can't get feedback. It can't be verified. So there has to be a very rigorous, extensive background to that, to work also up to remote viewing like that. Otherwise, so it's very difficult, even if you see something out on the web, Pine Gap remote viewed, to take that as gospel. I just want to say.
And then, we were chatting with Russell Targ and Lance Mungia, and we've been into the whole Third Eye Spies situation. And, you have pointed out to do a true remote view, and Russell has said the same thing. You can't just say, oh, I'm going to remote view something.
Oh, yeah.
Because your conscious mind has to be out of the picture.
That's
which
right.
means you need someone running this, and you, the remote viewer, don't know what the target is.
Yeah, it's you don't want to be front loaded in any way.
Right.
I mean, unless you're Joe McMoneagle or Lynn Buchanan, I'm sure these guys are at a place, or David Morehouse, where they have a way of dealing, or Paul Smith, with front loading. But generally, when you're doing remote viewing, front loading is a huge problem. So you don't want to have any knowledge whatsoever of the target, because as soon as you do, your left brain is in a position to compromise anything coming through.
And guess.
It's going to guess. And even if you don't think it's guessing, it's possibly guessing. So there are all sorts of factors, but that's one thing.
What we need, though, we actually could get like a team of remote viewers, including yourself, and we could have someone directing them, or like giving them assignments, but they don't know what the assignment will be.
Well, you have to be careful with that too, because
I volunteer to be the one directing it.
Why don't we get you to be the one remote viewing? That's the thing.
I don't know if that's a good idea.
Not saying, I mean, there is a lot to be said for remote viewing. One thing about Russell is he's out there really promoting, everyone can do this, and it's true. But there is, everyone can, but there's a lot behind coming up with accuracy when you are trying to get actionable intelligence or really dig for the truth on something like Pine Gap. So what Richard was just suggesting, you still know, that I would know within a good realm of what Richard would be wanting to task. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, but you wouldn't know when. You wouldn't know what necessarily. There's still a wide range of things that I might be able to task you with. There's
a wide range, but see, I could just right now begin to guess the type of range. I'm married to him, I know.
Right.
But there are a lot of things to consider. That's all I'm saying. When we're talking about remote viewing, why don't we remote view the moon? Why don't we remote view Pine Gap? And yes, we can. I mean, we can do it, but can we be guaranteed that our left brain is not compromising the information coming through? So
I still think You got me thinking
It
here.
can be done. It can be done.
We could get a little team of people, even here where we live. I bet there's a few, and we might be able to do a little something.
Well, I mean,
it would be a fun thing to try.
You could put together a group, and lots of these groups exist,
right?
And you definitely could organize something like that. But like I say, as you're
do it the
working
right
up to it, typically when people are training, you are mixing in many different things. So
there needs to be someone, actually 2 people, not one, who are providing direction, right? One person, and they are then, isn't it like when Russell Targ would give assignments, he wouldn't know all of the assignments either. Isn't that the case?
Right. So you're saying what you're trying,
double blind,
right? So yeah. So if I'm giving you the remote view,
right?
No, I don't even know.
Yes.
It's coming from somewhere else.
Correct.
I'm just giving an envelope that has a number on it.
And that's all.
Yeah.
That's how it works.
Yeah.
Doesn't make sense. Why? This is the whole remote viewing thing. None of this makes sense, but it works.
I will say, for myself personally, it is easier, and Russell and everyone will agree with me who's done remote viewing, seriously, it is easier if you know nothing. So, then if you're guessing out of 52 cards, it is easier. It puts something in you at ease, actually, that I can't guess.
Well, I'm going to suggest we get close to wrapping this up.
Oh yeah, we're going on.
Well, it's actually 80 minutes, and we probably want to get close to doing this whole thing.
Yeah, the little wrap up thing.
All right. What do you think?
Yeah.
I think this is fun. I'm glad we did the remote viewing, but we can come back to remote viewing.
On it.
Right.
From Ton, why did I start following you guys? Now I'm hooked. Oh, that's nice. Thank you. Let's see.
Someone asked are there any discussions between myself and Michael Schratt that he could look up? That's a great question. I really love Michael Schratt's research. He's an outstanding researcher at what he does, and he's been now involved in the UFO field for a long time. Michael Schratt's probably the best expert in our field of a lot to do with aviation technology. We correspond every now and then, and but we haven't really had in-depth conversations lately, and I think it would be a good thing maybe to get Michael on and have a nice conversation with him. So thanks for the suggestion. Anything else? Who is Richard's most influential mentor? I've had a few. I'll start with my mother and father. But that goes without saying. In the university, there was a professor of history named Stuart Campbell, who is long retired, and love Stuart. He taught me a lot about how to go through history and how to approach intellectual history back in those days. I liked Stuart because he, here I'm 19, 20 years old, and he really helped me believe in myself as a future historian and gave me such great encouragement. And not any mentors through most of my 20s, I have to say.
But you have some that you read.
Yes, indeed.
Marcus.
Oh, Marcus Aurelius is probably my favorite author of all time, the ancient Roman emperor.
I knew I'd get him there. Yeah.
Yeah, I've probably read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations probably, 20, 30 times or more.
Excuse me.
And then of more contemporary writers, a big one was Gore Vidal, actually. His brilliant political essays, a lot of good fiction as well. I was a big fan of him. But his political essays were, in the context of the 1980s, you got to remember, he was as cutting edge as you could probably get. There were folks like Noam Chomsky as well, who back in the 1970s and 80s were pretty advanced for me, and both of them influenced me quite a bit. Another writer in my 20s and 30s was Friedrich Nietzsche. Read probably all of Nietzsche's books. And what inspired me about him, I'll never forget, I was about 34 years old, and I reread Nietzsche's book called Daybreak, or the Dawn. And as I was reading it, I thought, this guy was my age when he wrote this book. And it's just such a brilliant, like a work of genius. And I thought, what am I doing wrong? Like, he's doing this amazing thing. Of course, he's
Clearly
like twice as smart as I'll ever be. But I thought, here he is doing something really incredible. And I want to get off my ass and do something really noteworthy too. So it was kind of an inspiration. And another great writer, two other Russians were Fyodor Dostoevsky and Leo Tolstoy, were great influences on me, like mentally. I read Tolstoy, and of course, War and Peace was the greatest thing I've ever read in my life. And Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, and the brothers Karamazov, just absolutely breathtakingly beautiful books. So I don't know if they're really mentors, but they were definitely important for me. Very much, very, very strong influences in my development, for sure.
All right, I think now I'll do it. Now we're going to wrap it up.
Do the wrap up.
We're going to wrap it up. And I'm just glancing down at the chat, and I just see, again, the whole chat family is here. I recognize every single name I see going down there right now. Every single one of you.
It's the chat fam.
It's the chat family. So we have to take a moment to say hi to the chat family and thank you all. And we love having, like, all of you. Recognize, like, all of you. Hi.
Hey, one thing I want to say. Someone writes Tolstoy depressing, sad. No, not true. Tolstoy not depressing, not sad. You get into Tolstoy. And in fact, I'll give you an assignment. Don't read War and Peace. That's kind of long. That'll take a long while. But read The Death of Ivan Ilyich. If you want serious, in-depth insight into what is life all about, that's a book. It's a short story. It's like a sliver of War and Peace. And it's all about, like, what are we doing here? What are the important things in this life? Read The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy. It'll make your week. It'll be a beautiful experience. So there.
Maybe it's the titles that sound depressing. Actually.
Oh yeah. Kind of a downer, right?
Yeah, I was like,
well,
yeah, I know that story.
But seriously, true genius.
Story.
And look, whether you live one life or multiple lives, this life that you're living matters. Like, this life matters. So make it count and get into some deep issues. And Tolstoy is a beautiful way to get into them, as is Dostoevsky. And I mean, there's writers living today that'll do it as well, but I like the old timers.
Those are your peeps.
They are indeed.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We all have our inspirations, but thanks for sharing yours. And again, thank you again to everyone for being here with us. It makes it all so worth it that you're here. And thank you for a great presentation. Again, it was wonderful.
Love doing it.
And anything else we want to share with them?
Well, we're going to be a little incommunicado
that's right.
next week, so I don't know if we'll be able to do this show live, and I don't know if we're going to be able to do a pre-record of it. So we actually might
not be here next week.
We may miss next week.
We might be on a MUFON cruise.
It is. I've never done a cruise in my life, so this is our first. We're doing it. We'll be out at sea. So I think it's going to be possible to do this. I don't
know if it's going to be either. I mean, we're going to look into it and see if there is an opportunity. It might not necessarily be Tuesday night at 8. It might be whenever we can do that. But I know there's a couple of you in chat who are going to be there.
Some of you will be there. So we'll look forward to seeing you there. And I'm doing a couple of lectures, so they'll be fresh, and they'll be that. I think we'll have a good time.
Of course, we'll have
hopefully
a good time.
We'll get motion sickness or anything like that.
No, we'll be good. We'll take all the supplies.
Bring some ginger.
Lots of ginger. And
yeah, I've never done this before. So
yeah. I think he's nervous.
First time for everything. We'll have a good time. But we won't be able to do this live next week. So we'll have to figure out something.
Yeah. And for those of you who've enjoyed the show and you appreciate Richard's research, one of the best and easiest ways to support him is to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and to turn on notifications so you know when we do release videos. Like when we're on a cruise and it comes up all of a sudden, if you have notifications on, you will get notified exactly when we are going live.
Absolutely. And thanks for mentioning that. Also, we have a newsletter. It's free. Go to any of the two websites, Richard Dolan Press or Richard Dolan Members. Subscribe free to the newsletter.
Subscribing
Yeah, the newsletter is not the same as being a member of the Richard Olin members. It's not the same thing. But the newsletter does give you free information in your mailbox every week about all the things that we're up to. There's more information at Richard Olin members. If you are interested, you can always become a member of that site as well. There's a lot of exclusive content there. We're creating things every week, all the time for that site.
That's right.
So that's it.
And for those of you who are watching Project Blue Book, enjoy the finale tonight.
Oh, yes. Well,
we do know what's going to happen.
We do. Yes, we know. We've seen it. So that's it. Okay.
Yeah.
Everyone.
Loved having you here with us. Thank you, everyone, so much for being here. We hope you have a great night.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming out, and we'll catch you next time. Later.
Take care.
Bye.
Good night.